Welcome to starting a technology company.
So today we're going to talk about moving on from kind of the research phase into the building phase. And this is where you go from some of the primary market research and planning that you've done over the last couple of weeks into, okay, what are we actually going to build now? In particular, what we're going to focus in on is concept of a minimum viable product. I'll give you a couple definitions of that as we go, but it's basically like the most restricted set of features that you can build that satisfy what I would consider like a core market demand or a critical market demand in your ICP, your ideal customer profile. And it's basically like the smallest version of the product that you can build that generates revenue is another way to think of it. So that's what we're going to focus on this week. How do you go from, okay, I've researched this, I've got a good sense of who the customer is, I know who I'm serving to, all right, what am I actually going to build? And that's going to be your MVP. So what we're going to try to cover is how do you actually figure out what goes into the MVP? How do you test that once it is in the market? And what is the data that we're going to pull back from that? That's sort of the theory. And then I'll actually show you how you do that with an LLM because the ability to do these with LLMs these days is awesome. And they are really, really good sparring partners for it. So I'll show you what that looks like in the context of one of our companies so you can actually see how this plays out. Little backstory on MVP. MVP is this term that was coined by Eric Ries, and he wrote this book called The Lean Startup. And in the Lean Startup, the concept of an MVP is really that it's a tool for learning more. So it's not so much that it's just the first version, although that's what most people call it. It's really like I put together the smallest version of the business hypothesis I have, like a fully featured version of the business that people would pay money for. And then I'm going to watch how they actually use it very closely. So the point there is not more than, hey, the MVP is something that we are doing. We're putting it out there so we can get even more data about is this a real business? It does not mean that it is cheap. It does not mean that it is incomplete. It has to be somewhat feature complete to the extent that it actually solves a real problem. But ultimately, what we're not trying to do is make a perfect product. It's a good enough product that we can suck a lot of data back in on so we can adjust our strategy so we know what features we should build for the rest of time, right? What features should go into our roadmap. What I would tell you though, an MVP is not, you're not trying to make like the small version of the final product. What actually goes into it has to solve a real and meaningful problem. And ultimately, while we'll get feedback on it, right, it's not clear that ultimately what we're going to build is the same as what we build in the MVP. It's definitely not an exercise in technical perfection or full system engineering. We're going to cut a lot of corners. We're going to do that thoughtfully. But this is not a product that we are building to scale up to millions of users and tens of millions of users. It's only got to work for a handful of them. It doesn't have to be particularly pretty. So it's not ultimately well designed. We don't have to give it all the visual bells and whistles we would want to put in a final product. It's also not something we can do in place of customer interviews. It's ultimately something that will help us drive a lot more customer interviews, and we'll talk about how that works. And finally, I would stress it still has to hit a high quality bar. So we will, if we put something out there that is buggy, that doesn't work, that will be negatively impactful or deleterious to our position. So it's got to be a real functioning product, even if it's not as pretty, even if it's not as final. It does have to work and it has to work reliably. Ultimately, it's how do I get the most information for the least amount of technical effort? What you're trying to get from that ultimately, first and foremost, is proof. The number one thing I want to get from an MVP is an actual human being that has paid for my product. If I can get someone to pay for a product, that is the most useful piece of data that I have. So whatever features we put in there, particularly for our ICP, have to hit that bar. It has to be something people are willing to pay for. Now, it could be that they're willing to pay $1,000, and on a long-term basis, I want them to pay $10,000. That's okay. But going from zero payment to someone actually paying for something, that is a huge leap, and the MVP needs to get you over that canyon. Um, we're only going to focus on building core functionality right now. A lot of stuff is going to come up as ideas of things we should build. We will put those in what we would call a backlog, which is just a list of, hey, here are our ideas for stuff we should go build later. And ultimately, what this should also do is drastically accelerate the pace of our learning. We're now going to go from here is a theoretical future product I should build to here is an actual product, and I can see how people are using it with what we would call product telemetry data coming back from it. All that noted, your mistake here will probably be to overbuild this product. In general, people err on the side of building too much functionality into the MVP and ultimately building too many features or building the wrong features. And so, all things considered, if you're going to make a mistake, you're probably going to make it on the side of actually overbuilding versus underbuilding your MVP. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of different definitions for an MVP. I like to think of it as it's the narrowest version that solves a real and compelling need and generates data that the business will work, what features people want, how do they want to use them, and how do they want to interact with the product. So you can kind of think of that as validated learning, which is it's not my opinion anymore. It's actual user behavior we're seeing in the product and actual hard facts that we have about it. It will tend to be more feature complete than a prototype. A prototype is generally used as saying, hey, does this technically work? Versus an MVP is a fully featured product. But the line between prototype and MVP is pretty fuzzy. You will couple the MVP with pilot implementations. Pilot implementations are the actual way you go about deploying your MVP towards two customers. So, as an example, for an MVP, it's not feature complete. So, it may not have all of the best onboarding. It may not have the prettiest onboarding flow. It may not be the most forgiving. That's okay because what we can do in an MVP is actually use our time as the founder to help people get up and running on the product. Concept of validated learning just basically means you're learning things that are supported by evidence and data. So because we've gone through the MVP process, a lot of the times people will now try to go out and raise more funds. And we're raising funds based on facts that we have about the business rather than suppositions we have about the business. You'll hear me use the term core workflow a bunch. A core workflow is the end-to-end path that gives you value in the product. And so, as an example, a core workflow for a product we'll talk about later, air traffic control, is being able to ingest content from someone's websites, ingest the list of users that they have, and then make recommendations to those users. So it's the absolute simplest path through the application for it to do something useful for you. The core workflow for Google is going to a page, typing in a search query, and looking at results. The core workflow for Facebook, outside of signing up, could be logging in and seeing what your friends are doing. It's the thing people do over and over and over again, and we're optimizing for making that as simple as possible. And then the final concept you'll hear me talk about is time to value. Time to value is the time from them landing in your application to them getting the material value of the application, the core benefit that they want to get out. And to make it simple, we want to make that as short as possible. So if someone can get to your application and get value from it within 30 seconds, that's awesome. That's a good time to value. In contrast, if the time to value requires you to set up the application, integrate it with a bunch of stuff, and it takes days, that's a very bad time to value. We want that to be as short as possible. To give you the context of where this sits in the rest of the course. So, first, we talked about business opportunity versus ideas and what makes someone willing to pay for a solution. We then talked about who is actually using that solution. That's a combination of personas, segments, and ideal customer profiles. We talked about how you can go out and validate your assumptions about your business and how do you run interviews, both synthetic interviews and real interviews. And so now you're at the point where we've taken all that data and now we're going to say, okay, based on all the insight I have, what do I want to build and what is the order of actually building these things out? MVPs are kind of the gold standard of ways to validate businesses. So again, investors will generally want data that your business works rather than just it being a good idea. Certainly it has to be a good idea, but showing that actual people are using this, that is a signal and that is a piece of data that says people are willing to pay money for this solution. That is what we're trying to accomplish with an MVP. Go from not paying to paying Or another way to think of it is going from not generating revenue to generating revenue. And this forces that in the process. The things you're trying to answer as part of that MVP is this business problem really compelling enough that someone is actually willing to try a product, that they're willing to pay for that product, that they're willing to change what they currently do, modify their existing behavior. And ultimately, those are signs that the pain is strong enough to drive someone to change from what they're doing to do a different, take it on a different approach from their status quo. There's lots of different types of MVPs. Most people these days end up using the last one, which we'll talk about the most. But historically, you could also use things as simple as a demand test. So an MVP could just be that you put up a page that is targeted by a bunch of Google ads that advertises your solution and asks someone to sign up for a wait list for the solution. If people are actually willing to give you your information, that is a revealed behavior. That is enough information for you to say, hey, people are actually taking actions. So if you remember, we talked about the evidence hierarchy last time around. So, like, stated preferences are the least powerful or useful piece of information. Actual actions are the most information. So, a demand test is a good example of that. They actually took action to sign up for something that indicates interest beyond sort of a passing fancy. Historically, when software was more expensive to create, people would also use things like Wizard of Oz prototypes, which is I build a front end for something that has a complicated back end, and then I use a human to do the back end to see if it actually works. You could have clickable prototypes people could use. That said, with coding agents these days, most of the time, the next step in the process is actually build out a real working prototype. And as I mentioned, the line between MVP and prototype is very fluid these days. So in most cases, once you have a good idea these days, you go ahead and build out a version one of it that people can play with and they can interact with it. You could do that on low code tools. You could do that with full coding environments. But basically, getting people into and using your software and then watching how they use it, which we'll talk about in a second, that tends to be the best way to do things these days. And you can actually obviously fully prove out the business. With that noted, as an example, if you go to an investor and say, hey, I have an idea and I'd like you to invest in it, versus, hey, I have a working product that people are actually paying money for, the latter is obviously a much more compelling investment opportunity because you've proven so much more about the business. So, in general, there are different types of MVPs, but most people these days are starting to just go ahead and build out actionable software for it. So, we'll focus overall on that. Um, you can think of that as a linear progression. So the reason you would use some of these lower fidelity approaches is if you just didn't have good information that people were truly willing to pay you money for your solution or give you something of value. And so a way to validate that earlier on can be to use things like demand tests or Wizard of Oz prototypes. Again, in our experience these days, though, most of the time you can actually build enough of a definition of a business working with LLMs so that you're confident enough to go ahead and invest in a software prototype, and the cost of the software prototypes are pretty low. I talked about this thing called a core workflow before, and I want to just take a quick beat on it. Your core workflow is like the thing the product does. And a way to think of that is what is the smallest number of steps for a person to have a wow reaction, or the way you really want to think about that is an emotional reaction to what your software does. So this is the point at which they've gone through one, two, three steps, however many it is, shorter is better. And they're like, oh my gosh, this thing is amazing. I have to have it. And the reason I'm using that is what you want is that level of reaction. It is not a logical, oh, this thing is good for me. It is, this thing does something so much better than what was before. It makes me happy. It reduces my sadness, whatever it is. So that's what you want to think of as the bar for your MVP. The core of it is this wow path, this core workflow, where at the end of it, the user is reacting and saying, this is so radically better than what I am doing now. I need to buy it right now. I want this product in my hands right now. And if you can get that level of reaction, that is a really compelling business opportunity as a general statement. And you can think of this if you remember probably prior to Google, when you would search for things, you would get terrible results. When you started using Google, you got amazing results. That is a wow reaction that you are having to that. You could think about the same thing for certain social media. You can think about it for like Uber as an example. Once you started using it, you could do something radically more advanced than what you could use before. That is the ideal situation you're focused on. And you want to do that with the absolute minimum number of steps possible, because ultimately that gets your time to value as low as possible. So your core workflow, core path through it, and that is what you're trying to optimize for. If a feature could be built, but it's not related to the core workflow, probably something you don't need to build right now. And you could build it later, but your MVP has that core path. And at the end of it, we want people to say, oh my gosh, this thing is great. And that is what you're optimizing for, which is time to value. Minimum number of steps to get to that aha moment. As part of that, you can do all sorts of stuff, but you're trying to rip out as many steps as possible. Anything that the user has to put in, where they have to give you lots of information, they have to fill out a form. We want to get rid of all that stuff. We do it later. And ultimately, you want to earn the right to earn more information and engagement from them. So think of that as value before work. I want to show you that the system will work as effectively for you as possible before you have to put in more time, more energy to refine it. Okay. How do we then prioritize the different factors? So we look at like five different factors to figure out what goes into an MVP. And again, I'll give you the examples of this later, and we'll give you all the prompts so you can play with this later on. But the first factor is pretty obvious. It's, is it relevant to a core pain that the customer has that we're trying to fix, or is it relevant to the core workflow? If it doesn't relate to addressing a core pain, it's not relevant to the core workflow, we would put that off until later. Is it critical? Same question. Do I absolutely have to do it on the path? If it's something I absolutely don't have to do, it can be something we can build later. Is it relevant specifically to the ICP? So we are only going to build an MVP for our ICP. That's a lot of acronyms. So to say that in actual words, we're only going to build this first version of the product for this narrow slice of the market where we think we can win. We're not going to build features for everybody else in the market. That'll come later. There is a technical aspect of this as well. So is it something I can build relatively cheaply? So as an example, maybe later on we build all of the optimizations for using different LLMs and querying different public data sources. But right now we're just going to pick a single LLM that we want to use, and we're going to implement it in the absolute fastest path possible. And then is it something that will help me get them to value faster? And so all of that means you're going to cut out anything that is nice to have, anything that's not on the core happy path, the primary flow through the application, anything you're excited about, but the actual end users don't care about, that goes, and a lot of the stuff that fits into the fit and polish categories as well. It doesn't have to look pretty. It just has to look good enough for people to get done what they want to get done. As we were talking before, we were talking about kind of the hierarchy of data, right? And so stated preferences are actually the least useful thing, and behaviors or payment preferences are actually the most important thing. So what we're trying to do with the MVP is get the highest quality data back that indicates that this business will work. Typically, what we see are three things you're really trying to accomplish with your MVP. The first thing could be a waitlist sign up. So in this category, I haven't built it yet. I got a pretty good sense of what I want to build, and I can communicate it well. So can I get someone to give me their personal information and a commitment that they will read some information for me in the future about this product? So that would be, yep, when this product comes out, I'm excited about it. I want to try it. Even better than that, though, is if the product is built, even if it's in a beta format and it's not quite ready to launch, can I get someone to put in their time to actually go through the product and give me feedback on it? If someone is willing to commit 15 minutes of their time, 30 minutes of their time to review a product implementation and tell me what they like and don't like about it, that is a very strong signal that says if that product does what it says it will do, if it ultimately solves that business problem, that there is market demand for it. And then finally, the absolute best thing is if I can get you to actually buy my minimum viable product. And that could be fully paying me for it. It could be committing to paying me for it once it comes out in final format. That is by far the strongest thing that we want to do. So ideally, we're working back from the highest priority thing, which is actually getting them to buy. If we can't get that, we get them to participate in the beta program. If we can't get that, we get them signed up for the wait list. And some of this is obviously a function of how built out your MVP is. So as you build your MVP, you can shift your goals to higher and higher proof points that are associated with that. In addition to that, we also can look at a bunch of metrics associated with those things to get a more subtle view of how the program is working. So, as an example, it's important that people sign up for a wait list, but I also want to see what is the rate of people signing up onto the wait list. So, it's a very different thing to say, I have 100 people signed up for the wait list versus saying I have a 0.01% conversion rate for the wait list. So, if I targeted 10,000 people and I got 100 to sign up, that's 1% conversion rate. I'd actually think about that one for a second. That's a great conversion rate. But if it was a 10% conversion rate, it'd be a phenomenal conversion rate. Or if it was a 0.01% conversion rate, it would be a pretty bad conversion rate. So we also want to look at the rates of those things happening. Ditto for how many people are willing to get into a beta program or a pilot program. An activation is when someone goes all the way through our core workflow. That indicates that not only is the product doing something that they want, but they're actually willing to spend the time to get on it. Do they come back and keep using the product over time? And ultimately, of all the people that we have into the product, how many actually convert into paying customers? Um, Typically, those metrics will also be correlated with, or sort of better way to say that is informed by just qualitative learning. And qualitative learning here is super simple. You have the MVP out there, you have a couple of people using it, you spend 15 minutes with them on the phone, talking to them about what do they like, what do they not like, what's frustrating, what's really interesting, what's not actually working in the product. And as much as possible, you want to couple that qualitative learning with the data that you're seeing. So we look at the data, we look at sign up rates, we look at commitment rates and pay rates, and we're talking to people that either process, and we use that to then go back and refine the approach to the MVP. You will also do this with a bunch of what you would call product telemetry or instrumentation in the product. If you're familiar with a product like Google Analytics, Google Analytics is just instrumentation for websites. And so the reason we like that is it takes a lot of the qualitative stuff and makes it very, very quantitative. So we can look at all the things that people are doing in the product. We can track that by individual users. We can track that by paths in the products. And we can ultimately use that to figure out, are people using the product the way we thought? If they're not, how are they using it differently? And then how do we actually change that? We can also gather feedback from people in the product itself. So it's quite typical for MVPs to just add in very, very short, one line or one sentence or even a few word feedback points on, is this working? Is it not working? And then, as I mentioned before, what you're looking for is also to do some follow-up interviews. Very simple, 15 minutes, quick chats on the phone. How did you like it? How did you not like it? That kind of stuff. Ultimately, what we're looking for here are the patterns, not the one-offs. So what keeps on coming up? How does that compare to their expectations, right? So we thought they were going to go through this path, but they ended up going through it in different ways. And ultimately, again, what we're looking for here is the data signals, not the preferred preference signals. So it is what they actually do and how they behave. That is a lot more important to this than what they say. Most of the time, as you're going through this MVP process, you probably will do weekly updates to it. Classic software tends to be released more on like 2 to 3 week cycles. Here, you're down to days. So you're updating it as you go, you're changing things, you're tweaking it. And you're ultimately, again, trying to get it to a relatively stable feature complete place where you can then go through and figure out what is the final set of stuff we want to put in the real production version of this, which would be kind of your 1.0 version. As I mentioned, the stuff you'll probably do bad or you'll break in this process, you'll do inappropriately in this process. First thing you're going to do is you're going to build for too many people. So let's say you have three user types. Build your MVP for a single user type and user group alone. You can add on other ones later, but you don't necessarily need to do that out of the box. And related to that, the second thing you're most likely to uh, violate here or go off the rails on is building too many features. It's very easy to fall in love with something you think is a cool idea. You go ahead and build it out, specifically, especially today when it's a lot easier to build new stuff. You just build too many features. And then what happens is the users are confused. There's too much stuff in it. It's overwhelming. And you've gone from having a really simple, really, really tight solution to one that's complex and difficult to understand. Um, Other than that, the only other one I would really focus on is what we want here is data, not stated opinions. So what we're really looking for is what are the actual hard commitments to use the product, purchases of the product, even if it's at a lower temporary price point. When do people actually go through and use the thing versus saying, hey, this would actually look interesting to me? Because ultimately, what we want is people paying for the solution and having that demonstration of data for that. You will definitely have something that faces problems as it goes out there. You may come out with something and people ultimately just aren't using it. Most of the time, if they're not using it at all, that means we're not really solving a problem they actually care about. Even if they tell us they care about it, if they're not actually willing to try something, they probably don't care about it that much. If they do care about it, but they don't actually keep using it, we might not be solving a problem that's actually critical, or we might not be getting them into the system and actually using it. May also be that they're like, hey, I like this, but I don't actually like the way you packaged it up for me. You gave me a desktop application. I really want to use this on my phone. You gave me a standalone application. I really want to use this in the context of something else. It's also possible that they just don't understand what the solution does. And so that means our positioning might be off. We might not be clear about the problem. And ultimately, it may be that they use it, but they don't keep using it over time. And that means it's not a ongoing problem that we're solving. And we may want to think about that. The point here is not to say this is the exact list of stuff that can go wrong. The point here is something's going to go wrong. And that's actually the point of the MVP. We know it's not going to work perfectly on the first launch. So what we're trying to do is get it out there and then get data on what is working and what isn't, fix the stuff that's not working and refine it, keep the stuff that is working. And eventually that gets us to a point where we can be general availability or a GA release out to the market. Okay. So we said, hey, we'll go through this, then I'll actually show you what it looks like. And I'll pull up some solutions right here that you'll see in a second so you can actually see what this all looks like because it's pretty fun once you actually see this play out. But the assignment for the week is actually go through and try this. So you can brainstorm lots and lots of features with LLMs. And then ultimately, what you're trying to do is just figure out from those list of features, which ones do I want to build? As a pretty good number, five is my general recommendation. Now, what is a feature is kind of arbitrary and it can be defined in a bunch of different ways, but a feature tends to be an atomic chunk of functionality, some logical group of functionality that you have. And you kind of want to have about five, three to five is a pretty good number, assuming that the features are substantive in nature. And ultimately, what you want to do is use that to then create a prioritized list for your MVP. So, what this prompt looks like, and then I'll walk you through what the outlook is. You take from prior weeks the summary of your business, statement of your business problem and solution. This alone is enough information to come up with a list of MVP candidates. If you do have some more one, you can add in what your type of customer is. We haven't talked about business model. We'll add that next week, but just as a preview, here I'm just saying, hey, I'm going to sell this particular solution in a subscription model, and I'll explain what the solution is in a second. And then you can also say, who are we going after? Who is the primary persona? For an MVP, you're really focused on who is your buyer and seeing if your buyer is willing to pay money for this solution. If your buyer and your user are different people, it's actually more important that we make sure that the buyer is willing to pay for the solution than the person that they're buying it for is at this point. We will have to ultimately build the solution for the person they're buying it for, but it's actually most important to make sure that the primary buyer is in there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to tell the LLM generate a series of feature ideas. Each of these features is going to be some functional outcome, something you can do in the product. It's got to be something that's critical in the context of what we would call an MVP, and the LLMs are smart enough to know what MVPs are. It should be directly connected to the problem we're trying to solve, critical in the solution, and it's got to make sense in the context of this persona. And if you have an ICP and you want to add that in here too in the ICP. And ultimately, what we're not looking for here is exactly how we want to go and implement it. It's just like, what does this thing do? So we want high level, non technical, sort of core language that we can share in terms of what the solution is for. And then we'll give it some guidelines in terms of what to optimize for, which is the rules we were talking about. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be in the ICP. It's got to be in the boundaries. And then we'll give it some rules on how to actually format that. Now, in this case, the solution here is one of the portfolio companies we have in 1 to 100. That solution is called Air Traffic Control, or ATC. That's a B2B content personalization engine. So what it does is you have a marketing department, and a marketing department has a lot of content, and they have a bunch of potential prospects. And what this solution does is it matches those together. It basically says, hey, we looked at all the content you have in your library. We looked at what this particular person is interested in and what they're consuming. And so we're recommending that we send this person these next 3 pieces of content. And then it charges for that on a basic SaaS subscription model. So what I did is I took that solution and then I pasted it into ChatGPT. And what ChatGPT came back with was 20 odd recommendations. So it said, hey, the first thing you should probably make is the ability to take in a customer's content library and tag it out. And I can tell you that is, in fact, the exact first feature of this product that we needed to build. The second thing you should probably build is a sync between a CRM that has a list of contacts and accounts and a solution so that we can model those out into it. That is, in fact, the second feature that we built. You might want to build something like a buyer interest profile. So for each person and account, we can summarize what is the types of content they would most likely be interested in the context of a given business. You got to have some engine for matching between content and people or accounts. So it's content recommendation engine. You have a way to expose this to a sales team, so a sales team can use it, and so on and so forth. And I can tell you that of the probably first 10 features, we probably have built 8 of those features into the product ultimately. And of the first 5 features, probably all 5, maybe 4 of them would be in an MVP. Certainly the first 4 would be in an MVP. So my point there is not that that is exactly how you have to do it, but the LLMs are very, very good at understanding from a description of a business, here is a prioritized list of feature that you want to go and implement. And if I give it a reasonable definition of a feature, how you want to do it.